In the sweltering haze of a Carolina summer, where the air hung thick with humidity and the relentless buzz of mosquitoes, a shadow fell across the waters of Charleston Harbor. It was June 1776, and the might of the British Empire had come to reclaim its rebellious colonies, not with whispers of reconciliation, but with the thunder of cannon and the gleam of bayonets. The fleet had sailed south under the command of Admiral Sir Peter Parker, his ships laden with troops led by General Henry Clinton. They were the vanguard of Britain's new strategy, to strike at the heart of the southern colonies, where loyalist sympathies were thought to run deep. Just months earlier, in February, a loyalist force had risen at Moore's Creek Bridge in North Carolina, only to be shattered by Patriot militiamen in a swift and bloody rout. The British had expected a triumphant rendezvous with those loyalists, a swelling army ready to march on the rebels. Instead, they found silence. No reinforcements awaited them on the shore. The uprising had been crushed, its leaders scattered, imprisoned, or driven into hiding. Yet, the British commanders remained undaunted. Their fleet was a floating fortress. 9 warships, including the mighty 50-gun Bristol and the Swift Experiment, bristling with hundreds of naval guns. Against this, what could a ragtag colonial defense muster? Charleston, they believed, would fall like a ripe fruit, securing a vital southern foothold and sending shockwaves through the rebellion. Charleston, then known as Charlestown, was no mere outpost. It was the jewel of the South, the continent's 4th largest city and its wealthiest port. Rice plantations and indigo fields funneled riches through its docks, feeding the coffers of merchants and planters alike. Capturing it would not only deny the rebels a key economic artery, but provide the British with a secure base from which to launch further campaigns. From here they could rally the loyalists who surely still lurked in the shadows, divide the colonies, and strangle the revolution in its cradle. Clinton and Parker gazed upon the city from their decks, the spires of its churches piercing the skyline, and saw opportunity. The harbor's entrance, they reasoned, could be forced with naval precision, a bombardment to silence any defences, followed by a landing that would overwhelm the unprepared. But guarding that entrance, on the sandy spit of Sullivan's Island, stood a defiant obstacle, an unfinished fort. Constructed in haste from palmetto logs and sand, it was little more than a square redoubt, its walls rising barely chest-high in places, with platforms for just 26 cannon. The fort bore no name yet, but it would soon earn one in blood and fire. Commanding this makeshift bastion was Colonel William Moultrie, a veteran of frontier skirmishes, his South Carolina regiment a mix of regulars and volunteers, hardened by the heat and the cause. Moultrie surveyed his works with a quiet assurance, his men labouring under the sun to pile more sandbags and mount more guns. He knew the odds, outgunned, outmanned, exposed on an island that could be cut off by the tide. Yet, there was no panic in his demeanour, only a steady resolve. The fort, he believed, could hold, just long enough to make the British pay dearly for their arrogance. Not everyone shared Moultrie's optimism. Enter General Charles Lee, the eccentric and battle-tested commander sent by the Continental Congress to oversee Charleston's defences. A former British officer turned Patriot firebrand, Lee arrived in early June, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with growing alarm. He paced the fort's incomplete ramparts, his face etched with disdain. This was no stronghold, he declared. It was a trap, a slaughter pen waiting to ensnare its defenders. The walls were too low, the position too isolated. A single well-placed British salvo could turn the island into a graveyard. Lee urged abandonment, arguing for a retreat to the mainland where earthworks could be dug and the fight prolonged. His warnings echoed through the ranks. Fortify elsewhere, harass the invaders, avoid a suicidal stand. But Moultrie pushed back, his calm confidence a counterpoint to Lee's fervour. The fort commanded the channel. To yield it was to invite the fleet straight into the harbour. Internal debates raged, Lee's scepticism clashing with local pride as the summer sun beat down, turning the air into a stifling veil. Out at sea, the British fleet rode at anchor, sails furled, hulls rocking gently in the swell. Officers scanned the shore through telescopes, noting the half-built fort and the distant buzz of activity in the city. Confidence swelled in their quarters. The coming assault would be swift, decisive. On Sullivan's Island, Moultrie's men toiled on, convinced their defiance would turn the tide. Both sides eyed the horizon, certain the fight would be short, the victory assured. But in the oppressive quiet before the storm, one truth lingered unspoken. One side was gravely, perilously mistaken. To the seasoned eyes of Admiral Sir Peter Parker and General Henry Clinton, peering through their telescopes from the decks of their warships, the fort on Sullivan's Island appeared as nothing more than a hasty improvisation, a fragile bulwark destined to shatter under the weight of British firepower. Unfinished and exposed, its walls rose unevenly from the sandy shore, low enough in places that a man could almost vault over them without effort. Perched on a narrow island at the harbour's mouth, it was isolated, vulnerable to encirclement by sea, with no easy retreat to the mainland. And its armament? A mere 26 cannon, many of them mismatched calibers scavenged from whatever the colonists could muster. Against the combined broadsides of 9 Royal Navy vessels boasting hundreds of heavy guns, this paltry defence seemed laughable. Parker and Clinton had every reason to anticipate a quick capitulation. A few volleys to breach the walls, splinter the platforms, and send the defenders fleeing in panic. Charleston would be theirs by sunset. Yet beneath this apparent frailty lay an unintended stroke of ingenuity, born not from grand design but from the harsh necessities of a fledgling rebellion. Stone and brick, the traditional materials for fortifications, were scarce in the Carolina Low Country, too heavy to transport quickly, too costly for a war effort scraping by on local resources. Colonel William Moultrie, ever the pragmatic commander, turned instead to what the land provided in abundance: the palmetto tree, a resilient coastal palm with trunks as straight as masts, but soft and fibrous within. His engineers devised a simple yet clever construction: 2 parallel walls of these logs, stacked like cordwood, with a wide gap between them, some 16 feet across, filled loosely with sand dredged from the beach. It was an expedient solution, meant to hold just long enough, but it would prove far more formidable than anyone imagined. The secret lay in the humble physics of absorption, a quiet defiance of the violence to come. Palmetto wood, unlike the dense oak of European ships or the brittle stone of ancient castles, possessed a spongy, almost forgiving quality, its fibres yielding under impact rather than resisting rigidly. Cannonballs that would crack oak timbers or explode masonry into deadly shards simply buried themselves in the palmetto, their force muffled and spent. And the sand. That loose fill acted as a vast cushion, shifting and settling around each strike, dispersing the energy harmlessly into the earth. As Moultrie himself would later reflect, the balls were received by the palmetto logs and the sand as if they had been put into a bed of feathers. In contrast, a fort of stone or hardened wood might fracture catastrophically, turning inward on its own defenders with flying debris. Here, on Sullivan's Island, the very softness of the materials transformed weakness into an unexpected strength, a fortress that could endure where others would crumble. The British, of course, knew none of this. Their confidence rested on the proven doctrines of naval warfare, honed over centuries of dominance on the seas. A broadside from a line of warships was a symphony of destruction, guns roaring in unison, hurling iron at velocities that could punch through hulls and walls alike. Shock and awe were the cornerstones. Overwhelm the enemy with sheer volume of fire, shatter their morale before the first boarding party set foot ashore. Parker and Clinton adhered to this European tradition without question. Their fleet represented the pinnacle of imperial might, unmatched by colonial rabble. Why doubt? The fort's odd construction registered, if at all, as mere eccentricity, a sign of desperation, not innovation. As dawn broke on June 28, 1776, the British ships weighed anchor and manoeuvred into position, sails billowing as they formed their line of battle. Gunners stood ready at their pieces, fuses lit, eyes fixed on the distant walls. They were certain, a few thunderous salvos, and the issue would be decided. Unbeknownst to them, the spongy fortress before them held secrets that would upend every calculation. As the morning sun climbed higher over Charleston Harbour on June 28, 1776, the British fleet unleashed its fury. Admiral Parker's ships, arrayed in a precise line, erupted in coordinated broadsides, hundreds of cannon belching flame and iron in unison. The air shattered with a deafening roar, waves of smoke billowing across the water like a descending fog, obscuring the horizon in acrid grey. Each salvo sent shockwaves rippling through the sea. The concussive blasts felt as much as heard, pounding the ears and chests of those ashore. From the rooftops and wharves of Charleston, miles distant, civilians and soldiers alike watched the spectacle unfold, a distant thunder that promised devastation, the city's fate hanging on the thin line of Sullivan's Island. Inside the fort, Colonel Moultrie held his ground amid the chaos. With powder supplies critically low, barely enough for a prolonged exchange, he issued strict orders: no wasteful barrages, no frantic replies. Fire slowly, he commanded, deliberately, each shot counted and aimed with precision. His gunners, sweat-soaked under the relentless sun, took their time, sighting along the barrels, targeting the vulnerable quarterdecks of the British vessels where officers directed the fight. This measured cadence stood in stark contrast to the enemy's overwhelming volume, a calculated restraint that preserved resources while maximizing effect. As Admiral Parker himself would later concede in his reports, the fire of the enemy was slow but remarkably well directed. Emboldened by their initial onslaught, the British pressed the attack, maneuvering their ships closer to bring more guns to bear on the fort's walls. But the harbour held hidden perils. Poorly marked, a submerged sandbar known as the Middle Ground lurked beneath the waves, a shallow hazard that snared 3 vessels, the Action, the Sphinx, and the Siren. Their hulls ground into the shifting sands, keels digging in as the tide refused to lift them free. Immobilized and exposed, these ships became sitting targets, unable to evade or withdraw, their crews scrambling to lighten loads and warp off while under fire. Hour after hour, the Duel ground on, the fort's cannon methodically chipping away at the invaders. British rigging frayed and snapped under the accurate colonial fire, sails torn, masts splintered into jagged ruins. Hulls absorbed punishing hits, timbers cracking as balls hammered home, waterlines breached in places. Officers on the decks fell, struck down amid the splintered wood and chaos, while the flagship Bristol bore the brunt, her sides riddled, decks slick with debris. The relentless exchange wore on both sides, the heat and humidity sapping strength, the constant din numbing senses. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the water, the British ships wallowed in disarray, damaged, some still aground, their once formidable line fractured. The fort on Sullivan's Island, battered but unbreached, still stood defiant. Exhaustion gripped attackers and defenders alike, muscles aching, powder smoke clinging to every breath. Aboard the fleet, a quiet unease began to spread. This was no swift conquest, no easy breach. The plan, so meticulously laid, was unraveling before their eyes. As the relentless barrage stretched late into the day, British gunners redoubled their efforts, pouring concentrated fire onto the fort's walls in a bid to finally crack the stubborn defense. Cannonballs whistled through the smoke-choked air, slamming into the palmetto and sand with thudding impacts that shook the ground. Amid this fury, a single shot found its mark, not on a gun or a man, but on the fort's blue flag, the banner emblazoned with a white crescent that had flown defiantly since dawn. The staff splintered, and the flag tumbled down, vanishing into the debris below the parapet. For a tense moment, silence gripped the defenders. Without their colours aloft, confusion rippled through the ranks. Had the fort fallen? Was this a signal of surrender? Across the water, British observers strained to see, wondering if the colonists' resolve had finally broken. In that critical pause, Sergeant William Jasper, a young soldier from Georgia attached to Moultrie's regiment, stepped forward. According to later accounts, he turned to his commander and said something to the effect of, "Colonel, don't let us fight without a flag." Without waiting for orders, Jasper vaulted over the low wall, exposing himself to the full hail of enemy fire. He scrambled across the exposed ground, retrieved the fallen banner amid the whine of incoming rounds, and lashed it securely to a makeshift staff fashioned from a sponge-tipped artillery swab. Climbing back under the same peril, he hoisted it high once more, planting it firmly atop the ramparts where it caught the wind and unfurled anew. This was no grand strategy, but a simple act of determination, one man's refusal to let morale falter in the face of exhaustion and doubt. The sight rippled outward like a spark. Inside the fort, the defenders found renewed focus, their slow, deliberate cannon fire resuming with fresh purpose. From the distant shores of Charleston, where anxious crowds gathered on rooftops and batteries, the reappearance of the flag drew cheers, a visible sign that the island still held. Even aboard the British ships, the realization dawned: the fort had not yielded, its spirit unbroken despite the pounding. Aboard the flagship Bristol, the strain of command took a more personal toll. Admiral Sir Peter Parker, directing the assault from the quarterdeck, was struck by flying splinters as another colonial round tore into the vessel. Wounded in the leg and thigh, he refused to leave his post, but the injury compounded the mounting damage to his ship. Masts cracked, rigging in tatters, hull breached in multiple places. As officers around him coordinated repairs amid the chaos, the Admiral's pain mirrored the broader wear on the fleet, command decisions growing heavier under the unyielding resistance. By evening's approach, the blue flag still waved over Sullivan's Island, a steadfast emblem amid the haze. The British ships, battered and listing, fired on sporadically, their earlier assurance visibly eroded. But the day's end brought no clear resolution. As night descended on Charleston harbour, the British bombardment gradually tapered off, the guns falling silent one by one. The fleet's ships, many with hulls holed and rigging in disarray, could no longer sustain the assault. The Action, still aground on the sandbar, proved impossible to refloat under the circumstances. Her crew abandoned her, and American forces later set the vessel ablaze to prevent salvage. With no foothold gained and the risk of further losses mounting, Admiral Parker and General Clinton ordered a withdrawal, the battered warships limping out of the harbour under cover of darkness. The human cost reflected the engagement's lopsided nature. British casualties ran high, with numerous sailors and Marines lost, including several key officers struck down on their decks. American losses, by contrast, remained low, fewer than a dozen killed and a handful more wounded, thanks in part to the fort's resilient design. Strategically, the outcome marked a clear setback for Britain's southern ambitions. Charleston, the intended linchpin of their campaign, stood secure. The failure compelled the British to abandon plans for immediate operations along the southern coast, leaving the region largely unmolested by major invasions for the next several years. What had begun as a confident test of naval supremacy ended as a decisive repudiation of that approach. In the years that followed, the battle left enduring marks on the cultural landscape. The palmetto tree, whose logs had quietly defied the cannonade, emerged as a symbol of South Carolina's tenacity, woven into state emblems and law. The fort itself was renamed Fort Moultrie in honor of its commander, a quiet nod to the resolve that held the line. The victory's echo extended well beyond the harbour, reinforcing a sense of possibility among the colonies at a fragile moment. Word of the repulse travelled northward in the days that followed, arriving in the midst of heated deliberations over the colony's future ties to Britain. It did not spark those debates, but it bolstered the arguments of those advocating a bolder path, underscoring that imperial power was not invincible. While British guns faltered against a makeshift fort in the Carolina heat, leaders in Philadelphia were forging a rupture far more profound, one that no armada could mend. In the next episode, we turn to July 4th, 1776, when that break became irrevocable. If you've been gripped by this gritty tale of revolution and resilience, consider subscribing to our channel for more immersive dives into the Revolutionary War's pivotal moments. A like and share would help spread these stories far and wide, ensuring the lessons of the past endure. Thank you for joining us in this journey back to the fires in the Age of Revolution. Until next time, remember, in the heat of battle, courage is forged.